Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the Musings from the Mount podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Carenza. In today's episode, we're discussing a subject that may cause some discomfort, but that's exactly the point. We're exploring the idea of necessary breakdown and why our modern obsession with comfort might actually be preventing us from becoming who we are meant to be, and how sometimes the most loving thing the universe can do is let our perfectly constructed lives fall completely apart. If you've ever felt like you are holding onto something too tightly, or if you are in the middle of your own breakdown right now, this conversation may hopefully change how you navigate and relate to your experience. We hope you enjoy the episode. And if you do enjoy this podcast, please consider going to meditationmount.org and donating. Your donation helps us to bring you this podcast, as well as all the other programs the Mount produces, both today and in the future. We're incredibly grateful and honored by your support. Now back to the podcast as we take on Necessary Breakdown. In trying to wrap my head around how to approach an episode on Necessary Breakdown, one of the things that kind of came to mind to me was like, how do we approach breakdown in the West in our current state, 2025, and compare it to maybe some other cultures and also historically. So it started to dawn on me that, we've sort of lost or traded our sense of adventure, maybe for a sense of comfort. Because why are we so afraid of breakdown, or why does breakdown seem so intense now in a way that didn't necessarily historically there's breakdown everywhere, but now we're very reluctant to put our chips on the table in the way that people used to be. It's like our main function seems to be now for comfort as opposed to maybe adventure,
Right.
And so I was thinking of that line, of course, from Leonard Cohen, from his song Anthem. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
Exactly.
And I thought maybe interesting, to also, to start from there. But in that same vein, though, I was thinking that is a concept that exists in many traditions. And like the Sufi, like Rumi, the wound is the place where the light enters you.
Exactly.
And so I just found that's a very maybe interesting jumping off point to look at this.
I believe there is a tendency now to protect ourselves from wounds, from cracks, from openings. I believe it goes back to the deepest fear, which is the fear of death, which behind that is the fear of the loss of self. If a culture does not embrace death and have it as a natural cycle in the ongoing regenerative process of life, it will fear death, and it will do all it can to avoid the topic and to preserve forms, because the preservation of form prioritizes the, if you like, the continuous upgrading of forms, which happens through the cycle of death and rebirth. And so I mean, we have to have a little humor in this as well, Joey. So I was thinking, as you were speaking, it's consciousness that preserves forms, not Botox.
Wait,
seriously,
yeah,
Botox freezes
Mm-hmm.
the current state of the form.
Mm-hmm.
But a form is the result of an inner impulse. And the form's function is to respond to the call of the spirit, to give expression to it. And if the spirit is this dynamic expression of life, it needs a form that is flexible, malleable, fluid, and can adapt to the new signals coming from the inside. Therefore, when we freeze up and when we see change as a threat and the dissolution of the form as a threat, what we're doing really is we are doing ourselves a disservice. We're strengthening the prison walls in which the spirit is captured. So rather than the form being the natural expression of the soul in time, space, and substance, the form becomes our refuge from the fear of death. I mean, I hadn't thought of that before, but as you were speaking, that's what was prompted by your by your question. And also, the crack is where the light gets in, and I'd love to explore that. You talked about the whole thing of a necessary breakdown. I sent you an excerpt from a book that came my way a couple of days ago, which really touched me. It's a very simple thing, but I'd like to read this excerpt. And I titled it A Necessary Breakdown because it's got some humor in it. We talk about dark humor. This is light humor to illuminate the darkness. That's what dark humor is. It's lightness to illuminate the darkness.
Yeah.
So here it is, and I hope I can do justice to the writer's words. She's having a total breakdown. One put together and very self-satisfied seed with no cracks in it whispered to another about a third seed who had begun to germinate. She's completely falling apart. Her life is a mess. They gazed superiorly at the smooth, intact facade of their shells, so perfectly upholding expectations of the status quo. Clearly, compared to that wild, sprouting seed disrupting the peace, they were doing something right. Right? But now and then, they secretly looked up with longing at the tall-stemmed, beautiful, and bravely opened flower nearby, wondering if there might be more to themselves. And one day, when the inward agony of her outwardly perfect and tidy life became too much, one seed scooched herself close to the flower and asked in hushed tones, "How do I become more like you?" And the flower smiled. "You must first be willing to have a total breakdown of every identity you've known. And then you must be so bold as to let your previously predictable life become a wild, sacred mess." And that's taken from Wild Grace, a book by Chelan Harkin. I just thought that was a beautiful depiction of the nature of form life and the dance between spirit and form. What does it do for you, Joey, when you hear that?
Well, when I read that, I couldn't help but think that it was right. It was the encapsulation of my whole story. And from an outside perspective, it would seem that I was living a pretty wild life. I mean, I dropped out of college after my junior year. I went on tour with a band, making $10 a day. But even all through that, I still maintained for a very kind of almost autistic kind of fortitude in terms of structure and life, and because of that, I rose very quickly through the ranks. And it wasn't until I really my life took a different kind of turn, and I really let my life fall completely apart. And in retrospect, I see that it was absolutely necessary for me to go into the wilds in order to grow and to break through. And it's also, it turned out it's kind of a touchy subject especially in the recovery world, that I don't look poorly, or I look quite fondly upon my time in the desert, so to speak. It was a necessary thing. All these forms, all these ideas of who I was or what I thought life was, all had to fall apart. And without that, I could not have grown in the same way that if you want to build a muscle, the muscle has to tear so it can grow.
And when the muscle really strengthens, it's when you take your day off.
Yeah, that's what people don't realize. Yeah.
It's important what you just said. The willingness to let go. It's as though our lives are constructed. There's this need for comfort. You mentioned comfort to begin with. The comfort is, I want everything to be okay. A friend of mine at work used to joke and say, "Please, dear God, please make the bad people go away." And you realize that we're given these tests in the classroom of life to strengthen our spirit's ability to utilize form to express the deep purpose that lives inside each one of us, inside our one humanity, and inside the planet as a sentient being. So purpose cannot be fulfilled unless there is a willing and able form that can respond to that purpose. And so the only way you can evolve forms is then to go through this rapid cycles of death and rebirth, because every time they're reconstructed, hopefully, at a higher frequency, unless you get stuck in the addiction loop.
Mm-hmm.
You go round and round and you just reinforce the pattern. But once the pattern's broken, the form is held in place by consciousness. And I was thinking, forms cannot be unbreakable
Mm-hmm.
because that would imprison spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Spirit is irrefrangible. Spirit can't be broken.
Mm.
It's indivisible. But it can show up in many places simultaneously. But spirit itself is indivisible because it is an aspect of the one life. So for me, when the affirmations in the Ageless Wisdom teaching talk about may the soul control the outer form, it simply means that may we utilize form as a way of carrying out the desire of the Creator, and not as a way of either seeking comfort, which really is taking ourselves out of the game. Goes back to that thing of, wouldn't it be nice to just curl up in a blanket in a fetal position and wait until this life is over? I hadn't thought of it now, but as I was speaking, I was reminded of a very powerful experience I had. A friend of mine in Brazil came down with a brain tumor, and they had a major operation. And the operation didn't go as well as planned, and they didn't regain consciousness. They were basically in this state in a coma. They were comatose. And when I used to go to Brazil fairly frequently to teach, and I remember visiting my friend and sensing that inside he had given up. I had this sense of, like a bird creates a nest. He created a nest on the inner planes of these dreams of cotton wool, of warm blankets, and he was hiding out in there. And so I did this bold thing. I actually whispered it in his ear because I believe, and I know that he could hear everything. He was just in this vegetative state. I said to him, look, you have a choice. You can't stay in the cotton wool forever. Either choose to come back or let go and recycle. He'd been in this state for 6 to 8 months. And then within a couple of days, he started to stir, and then he started to come back. And he came back to the point where he could understand speech, he could respond by pointing to things, but he didn't have the facility or the faculty to communicate more directly. But he'd made a choice to return. And so he just needed somebody to say, look, you can't stay in comfort forever. Comfort is the graveyard of the spirit, as Agni Yoga said. No, being comfortable, you can be comfortable in your own skin, and you can be comfortable wearing good clothes, you can be comfortable. But when you use comfort as a refuge from your destiny, it becomes something that imprisons. So that was a very powerful experience. And even though I was talking to him, I realized I was talking to myself, Joey. So there are times when I feel, oh, I just, just let me get through this day, one day at a time, rather than say, hey, how can I be of service today? How can spirit show up today through me, through my form? And if my form isn't adequate, please refine it, please upgrade it, which means a lot of polishing and cutting of diamonds. So I hadn't thought of him. He died about 5 years ago. And that was a very poignant time because it went back to, it's the will that sets in motion the life of the form. And if we don't have the will to change, the form doesn't change. It will eventually degenerate and dissolve over time through age and disease. but we can preserve it by our unwillingness to let go.
Mm.
We drive with the brakes on.
Yeah.
So that story just came to me now, and I have a lot of love and compassion because I can imagine what it's like to be inside a body where you're conscious, you're not able to communicate. What do? Do you hang around until it's time to go? Or do you let go, recycle, come back? That's an inner decision. And only your soul makes that. But you have to give your soul the freedom to make it by letting go of all your constraints and fears.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it ties back to what you were saying about we've become so scared of death. And I was just thinking of obviously this is not something that we want today, but the sort of the Viking aesthetic of there's, we'll die tonight and awake tomorrow in Valhalla. It's like,
I learned my organic farming from this old guy in the west of Sweden. He was an old Viking. He said, when I die, I want to go to Valhalla, and then that's it. And then they fight, and they drink, and they feast, and they kill each other, and they wake up again. They're regenerated in Valhalla. It's this eternal feast and this eternal battle. That's the thought form. The thought form actually is a construct. It goes back to the matrix. It's a matrix we create that we can live inside. And you can actually go through a couple of lifetimes living inside this self-constructed matrix. The matrix is a form, remember, and eventually the form has to break to release us from the matrix. How do we unplug from the matrix? We take away our energy that gives life to the matrix. We don't believe in it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too. That kind of ties into it in the way up here. I often take every other day I run, and then the other day I take my puppy to the beach so that he can run off the leash. And I was thinking as I was driving up here, and I still had sand on my feet, and how when it comes to forms, and we're guilty of this living in Southern California. It's one of the reasons we live here is we're always pursuing that endless summer, and we've talked many times in many episodes about all the different seasons. But when you are trapped in kind of an endless summer, you forget sometimes of the necessity, even though it's all around you. The ocean is constantly recycling. We're surrounded by deserts, that there's nothing but,
And wildfires come through.
Exactly. But sometimes in that pursuit of endless summer, you lose sight of the importance of the winter and of the necessary breakdown of the vessel.
It's interesting because the endless summer is an attachment to a form. I was just thinking, one of the esoteric names for Sanat Kumara, who's the embodiment, if you like, of our earth, is the youth of 1,000 summers. Which doesn't mean he's stuck in one summer, but it's a perpetual summer. But the only way is you've got to go through all the different seasons. But what it's saying is you're at a place of constant sunshine, i.e. the soul is constantly shining through you. Here in Southern California, we just love it when the sun's shining on us.
Yeah.
And we can wear shorts and T-shirts most of the year.
Yeah.
But that could easily be a trap of not wanting to go into the cold, not want to experience the different seasons. But I go back to this thing of, if you have a form that can't be broken, imagine a chicken lays an egg, and the shell is so hard, the chick that forms inside can't break through. What happens? It dies. It's stillborn. The forms have to be breakable because they're temporary casings for the promise that lives inside of them, which is the germ of life.
Yeah.
The seed is a casing plus an interior. You and I are casings plus an interior. Our casings have to be upgraded all the time by being broken. Now, broken, it doesn't mean taking a sledgehammer to them, although sometimes that's what's needed. Like, as you said in your life, it took something that heavy-handed to get you to knock on your door.
Yeah, it took a tsunami and a tornado and a flood and
like, who's that knocking on my door?
Yeah.
So the thing is that we're talking about living in a time now where so much is breaking apart. And it's breaking apart because it's not being held, if you like, by the note of the soul of humanity. What really holds forms in place is the soul. And when the soul needs to change its forms, it either upgrades them and we go through the tests, or it recycles them and we go through death. But it's the soul that controls the outer form. When we're here to preserve the different forms, then we run the danger of being locked into a fixed way of how things should be, whether that's a mindset, emotional patterns, uh, just physical rituals, because we are unable to dance with life. So I think we're going back again to our favorite movie, Joey, The Matrix.
Yeah.
It's a self-constructed world, which is a form world. And the form world is what we call the three worlds of illusion. And those three worlds of illusion are a temporary formal construct. Now, we've said before in these podcasts, when we talk about matter and forms, we're not saying they're bad. Matter is spirit vibrating at its lowest frequency. And matter is spirit vibrating, at its lowest frequency, and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we're saying is that you utilize form to shape whatever is needed to give expression to that indwelling purpose, but you don't allow the outer form to dictate the course of your life. The soul controls the outer form. And by control, I mean it's got its hands on the steering wheel. It decides when it's time to go left or right or straight ahead, or to recycle the car.
Mm. I kind of feel like that's like the myth of the perfect shell.
Yeah.
It's like one of the things you start to observe is like once you start to see the fractal nature of life, and whether it's through a vegetable or through a literal seashell, you see how there's a beautiful fractal patterns and how, the Fibonacci sequence, but they're not perfect. Every shell is different. And one of the things that was very difficult for me as a young person, trying to be in a band, trying to make music and art, and my good friend Jerm Pollitt had this thing above his desk that said, "Done is better than perfect." And it seems like such a simple line, but man, did I struggle with that. And he did too. We talked about this a lot, that, just wanting things to be perfect will cause you have absolute paralysis.
Well, see, this is the relationship between spirit and form. You go back to Agni Yoga.
Yeah.
He said one of the urges inside this spirit is something called perfectionment, which simply says, hey, if I'm going to do justice to who I am, I need an outer form that can express it. So let's get the outer form together. I mean, the band goes and practices in the garage. It only comes out when it can play what we've written. So this perfectionment can be a two-edged sword. It can be this wonderful urge, striving to be the best you can be, or it can be, oh my God, I'm not good enough. I'll never be good enough. Well, in one sense, you'll never, in this human form, reach perfection, because perfection is reached beyond the human consciousness. In fact, that's when you know you've reached a new stage, when you're no longer in this dichotomy of spirit and matter, when the soul is, and simply is a presence unto itself. So I think this whole notion of perfect, and in working with continuous quality improvement inside the corporate world, it was called total quality control in Japan. Dr. Deming worked on it. So these words, total quality control. There are two words in there, total and control, which are antithetical. to the American psyche.
Mm-hmm.
So when Dr. Deming, who is an American, went to Japan, was recognized for his great gifts, when he tried to bring it back into America, I was part of this whole movement back in the 80s and 90s in the corporate world, where we were running into issues with calling it total quality control. In Japan, where it was accepted, total means we're all one people, is not a problem. Control means you're always being supervised. Your ancestors are always watching your every move.
Mm.
So you're used to it.
Mm-hmm.
But here, anything that's total or totalitarian, don't tell me what to do. Control, you don't control me. I've got free will. It could not be digested.
Mm.
So we called it continuous quality improvement. Because in the Japanese psyche, this is what was discovered through these archetype discoveries that were being done. In the Japanese psyche, you could be perfect even while you were a human.
Mm.
You could become a national treasure and recognized as a national treasure, which was an affirmation of your perfection in something. Whereas in the Judaic-Christian tradition, in the American psyche, you could only be perfect after you're dead.
Mm.
So asking somebody to be perfect was asking them to die.
That's fascinating.
And I went, whoa. So we changed the language to help. So we didn't use total control. It was continuous quality improvement, where it's never ending. You can always get better. You can always get better.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't this threat because I can only be perfect once I've died.
Mm.
And therefore, you're dealing with the different cultures' relationship with death and regeneration. I just found that fascinating because here was this engineering process, Joey, that revealed the deep psychic relationship that this culture has with death and life and the whole thing.
I mean, that is absolutely fascinating, especially when you think of from an engineering perspective. Like you inevitably make mistakes. There's no such thing as perfection. It's a constant balance of dependencies and tolerances.
Well, the big problem with continuous quality improvement inside America, inside the corporate world, as I experienced, and I worked many years on this, was the fear to admit a mistake had been made.
Mm.
Because when you make a mistake, you're normally punished. But unless you make a mistake, you can't, or unless something doesn't work, you can't grow by understanding why it doesn't work.
Mm.
So people, to avoid being punished, i.e. killed, would lie and would hide the facts. Well, the whole of CQI, or continuous quality improvement, is built on managing by data. How can you manage by data if the data is distorted or withheld? And we used to joke that data can be tortured to confess to anything.
Oh yeah, I love that book, Lying with Statistics. And love them or hate them or however you are feeling different about them. That's one interesting thing about the way that Elon Musk does things is they're more than willing to blow rocket up after rocket, in the pursuit of pedal to the metal, engineering. And there's lots of different ways to look at that, but one of the things I do think is interesting is that the concept of light doesn't really enter through improvement, but rather surrender, crisis, and rebirth. And so, there's lots of different ways to say it. Alice Bailey said each initiation marks a point of breakdown and then rebuilding at a higher level.
Well, exactly. And that's what death does.
Yeah.
It allows us to upgrade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's sometimes it's hard to kind of wrap your head around that. Like, I was also thinking of how these, we've talked about it sometimes, but sort of the dark night of the soul, all these different names for this period of time. And even on someone like Krishnamurti, who was kind of cruising, and until his brother died, and he really had to, that was it. That decided he had to make this huge shift in his life. I mean, he could have cruised the rest of his life, been taken care of, eaten the finest foods, flown around the world, and he could have lived the life of the lavish guru if he wanted to. but no, he took a different path. He saw that, he saw that deconstruction of form, and he had to take a different path. And I think that's what happens is like when I was kind of trying to tie that in with this idea of avoiding discomfort.
Yes.
I mean, that was whether he was consciously calling to adventure or relinquishing adventure,
It was his willingness to die in order to be reborn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Continuously reborn.
Yeah, and there's also that kind of Wizard of Oz vibe to that too. It's like he had spent his whole life depending on these people and looking up to them, and they assured him that of course your brother's not going to die. He's too important. So you have to come to this conference or come do this thing.
Right.
And the second he leaves, his brother dies. And like, so why like. And I think sometimes we can be a little bit callous in like the way that we look at it from a top view, but it's on a human standpoint. Sometimes it's so heartbreaking.
But as you were reading that or quoting that, it flashed on me that we have to make decisions based on our own inner knowing, not on outer circumstances. It goes back to the Buddha's last sermon. By thyself alone. Doesn't mean you don't listen to anybody else, but in the end, that which liberates you is your surrender to that aspect of the divine that lives inside of you. That it is your joy and privilege to reveal. But up until now, it's been a struggle because you didn't know that you were carrying this great gift of life. Life was a struggle. Life was a burden. And then the Buddha said, but you lay down your burdens by letting go of your attachments. You lay down your burdens by liberating yourself. And you said earlier about, you go out in the world and you explore everything. And it's you've got to understand what the not self is in order to say, that doesn't feel like who I am. Because you can't immediately go, oh, this is the self. The way that I've experienced life is we understand what something is by experiencing first of all, what it isn't.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't resonate. And when something resonates, it means there's a connection between the inside and the outside. And therefore, the form is true. It's a true form.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not true, then we feel discomfort and we're not satisfied with ourselves, and we can get down on ourselves. Or if we're compassionate with ourselves, we go, okay, time to let go, time to upgrade. Okay, here we go again.
Yeah. I mean, when you were just talking about that, I was thinking about the discovering the self and the not self. And I couldn't help but think that, and this is more of a feeling like my concept of self is a vibe, not a person. So it's a note, that plays as part of a chord. And some notes resonate and some notes are dissonant, and just kind of in the process of devolving this concept of who I am in terms of a personality and finding just that it's a frequency.
That's a beautiful way of describing it. I would say it's a frequency that shows up as a presence. So it's the presence of a frequency. That presence, in order to touch the three worlds of the form, so the physical, emotional, mental, to actually arrive on earth, has to take on substance. Therefore, it takes on a selfhood. But you're right, the self in its own right is an aspect of the one presence. But in order for that presence to be present, it needs to take on a form. And I guess in our present stage of evolution, there's still a gap in the relationship between our form and our essence. We don't believe our form is part of our essential nature because it hasn't yet, as we've often said, we haven't yet created this soul-infused and integrated personality. Where there is a merger, it's called the first fusion. When my outer life, when my personality life is integrated, when I don't have any more patterns to work through, and when I'm aligned to that deep note inside of me, the note of the self, then my personality life is able to become at one with the soul. Soul-infused and integrated personality. That is the first fusion. And we've mentioned before when we did that 5-part series on initiation, Joey, the first fusion then allows you to create the vehicle that can receive the outpouring from an even deeper point of resonance that is your monadic fire, your monadic note. So all the time, the forms are the carriers into time, space, and substance of the essence of who we are, of the dream of the Creator. But when the form becomes the dominant player and starts to call the shots, then the world gets turned upside down. And we are living underground, basically.
Hmm. There was also something I wanted to kind of touch on. This might be a little, I don't mean lofty, but like kind of a concept that can be, you almost have to be unemotional to think about it, but it can be emotional. But so like in the Bhagavad Gita,
Bhagavad Gita.
Bhagavad Gita, it kind of depicts destruction as divine. And then when you start to wrap your head around that, what do you mean destruction is divine? Like, but then I was thinking of it in the concept of just the one and the zero, right? So it's like the realm of destruction, of course, like the dance of Kali is like that is the province of the divine, the great producing and collecting and recollecting.
But that is the whole Shiva energy, the whole Kali. You have the creator and the destroyer are the two aspects of the one purposeful note of life. In order for life to express itself, it needs to create. And in order for that creation to be a continuous expression, it needs to destroy the forms of what it's created so it can recreate. So life is a perpetual series of recreations because we're still part of the original story of creation. Creation has never finished.
Yeah. Yeah, and that dance clears the way for renewal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've used this. I wrote this little phrase a couple of years ago for a celebration of life that we did for somebody here. And I wrote, in the timeless pageant of life, throughout the cyclical procession of the seasons, the angel of endings always precedes the spirit of regeneration, so that the innate qualities of truth, goodness, and beauty may be born anew and revealed more skillfully and radiantly at every turn of the evolutionary spiral. Appearance, disappearance, and reappearance characterize the natural rhythm and flow of an emergent process guiding the unfolding of life in every moment. So that was part of what I wrote about this, honoring this person's death. And I actually had to change it from, I said the angel of death always precedes the spirit of regeneration. And the wife of this person said, no, no, please don't say death.
Yeah.
Because they weren't ready to accept. I said, endings. Then we'll say the angel of endings, which is dissolution, destruction. And in the alchemical process, the first thing you have to do is the dissolution of what's in front of you before you arrive at the solution.
Yeah.
And the resolution, the
Right.
resolution.
Yeah. I mean, like in Agni Yoga, I think there's the phrase, only in the fire of testing is the essence revealed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And
and to kind of wrap your head around, that is the province of the divine. And so, and sometimes it can be hard to think about that. And because it seems to be, I guess, a little callous to the idea of the human emotion that we, sure, that sounds great and all, but we're the ones that have to go through the fire,
It's the soul refining its capacity to build a vehicle on earth that's suited to its expression. And it uses its own self-appointed, self-created project manager called the human personality.
Yeah.
I mean, we're contracted. We're actually the contractor.
Yeah.
So we've been contracted by the soul. We are the soul. It's contracted with itself in time, space, and substance to carry out its mission. Because it, on its own level, doesn't have the forms.
Yeah. I also kind of see that as, I think I contemplate the zodiac quite a bit and how, people, what's your sign, what's your rising sign, what's your moon, and where the place I always arrive with that is like, okay, here this is your starter kit. You're I'm a Virgo with a Pisces moon and a Capricorn rising. Okay, and it can be all fine and good to go through life on like living within those parameters, but I see it as a challenge. Like, so here it's like, and when you spawn into a video game, you don't have 100% in every category. You have some, or maybe you have more strength or less endurance, or maybe you have more magic and less accuracy. Just depends. But your job is to transcend that and to sort of, not just be confined by the fact and go through life, oh, I'm a Virgo, so I have to see the world this way.
It's not an excuse for not changing.
Yeah. And I think we get into that with
oh, I'm a Pisces, so I'm sorry, that's just who I am.
Yeah, that's just me,
no,
Scorpio.
That's a cop-out, Joey.
Yeah.
A true cop-out.
And that's one of the dangers / illuminations I think that's happening. There's this thing that happens, especially with our younger seekers, the millennials and the Gen Z, is they do tend to like want to really label themselves and I'm this, I have to label everything about myself and put it into a box. And this is one of the things that I hope that they start to move through, and I think that they will. But I also am sort of enamored with their lack of sort of affinity for any kind of convention if it doesn't work, right?
Right.
And I see that like those breaking of those forms and those patterns can be really scary for maybe some of us older people who grew up in the time when, when we had radio and black and white TV and,
and that's how things are.
Yeah. And, and that is interesting, to watching them sort of deal with a sort of existential uncertainty that really kind of was a hallmark of older times. There was a brief period, and I mean brief in terms of human history, but really from about the end of World War II to maybe like sort of the late 90s when things started to not look like a certainty that you're guaranteed you're going to do better than your parents,
Well, this was the translation of the American dream through the agency of consumerism.
Yeah.
Now, the American dream is at a soul level. It's about a more perfect union.
Yeah.
It's not about more perfect washing machines.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah.
Or the color of your picket fence.
Yeah.
I'm being slightly facetious, but I think what we're talking about, Joey, there is the natural breaking down of forms when they've reached the end of their life cycle. But what we're witnessing now is this battle where there are people who are intentionally taking things apart, even though those things are still useful for the general public and for the good of the whole. It's what we call nefarious forces, because that's how matter keeps control, by being in control. And so what is the one threat to the materialistic forces? It's anyone who's almost liberated from the gravitational pull of matter. So you want to make sure that they don't escape.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to escape velocity, which is interesting that, so Alice Bailey's kind of vision, or the DK's vision of like the new world kind of rooted in group consciousness, for me, that manifestation is interesting in the sense of Bitcoin, like you have this distributed sense of these distributed servers,
right.
that are bringing in this new way of like interacting with this new form of energy. It's an amount of energy, and I find that fascinating how well it parallels the teachings and all the DK stuff, but also how there is like an inherent breakdown that's also very scary for a lot of people that have invested and are so invested in the older system.
Right. And the move to group consciousness the soul is already group conscious.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about creating forms that can express that group consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you've just given a great illustration
Right.
of.
Yeah.
So we have to see group consciousness as it plays out still as a form that serves the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we're at the moment. So it's very difficult to surrender totally unless you are secure in knowing that the soul controls the outer form, that you are in charge of your own destiny, that we are working with other more enlightened beings who have a deeper understanding of the purpose of the planet itself, and that we're all one team of different grades of awareness and wisdom working on this planetary project together. If I'm just here to be comfortable, get by, make millions, show others how good I am by parading my toys, then we're not playing the real game. We're playing a game that's been created inside the matrix, the illusory matrix. When you break the matrix, you enter into the planetary life itself, the auric field of the planet, and you start to pick up on the signals. And suddenly your life goes, oh, I'm called to do this. What makes the difference where somebody one day wakes up and is called to be kind to another? Where did that come from? If I've been selfish all my life, where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea too, because I've been hearing this pop up in the kind of podcast world. Paul Stamets recently been kind of saying this is that one of the big evolutionary things that pushes things forward, and if you examine any person's success story, it almost always boils down to some random act of kindness.
Yes.
Somewhere along the way, it doesn't matter how smart you were or whatever, somewhere someone did something that they just random, that wasn't going to benefit them at all, and it helped you in some way.
Because what you've then done, you've stumbled into the dance, which is, as I give of myself, I participate in the dance, and the dance gives back to all the dancers. You don't have to go out as a hunter-gatherer. We don't need hunter-gatherer consciousness.
Well, we've kind of perfected that at this point. At this point, we've already sort of, if you imagine that as like an old 45, we've played it so much we're wearing the grooves down, you know.
Right.
So I mean, it's a great tune. You can dance to it, but we've kind of figured out, we know how to dance that number. Maybe it's time for some new songs. You know.
It is, and what we've said here at the Mount, particularly when we do introductions to the sound baths or the sound meditations, that inside of each one of us is a note. It's a note of the original word of creation. It's our own signature tune. It's the song of our soul. It's a love song that wants to be sung. And so our task is twofold. One is to listen deeply in the living silence to the song of our soul. The other is to build the instrument of our personality that can play that song without distortion, that can play it with the greatest beauty. Therefore, we become the musicians of God. And that, when you go back to music and the Sufi musicians, they understood. There was a story I heard from, there was a jazz trumpeter called Don Cherry. And he lived in Scandinavia, and I met him. And he was telling the story of, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. It's a great story. But way back when, whether it's 500 or 600 AD, there was a trumpet player in the Turkish court there. And he played the perfect note and disappeared.
Yeah, I've heard that story before. Yeah. And, I mean, like, I personally, like, so I think my position on this is well stated. If you're a listener of this podcast, I tend to believe in the simulation theory, that we are living in some sort of simulation. And if that's the case, all manner of magic makes sense. It's all possible,
Well, magic is simply the precipitation on the outside of what we hold on the inside. And if its energy follows thought, and if the great simulation is creation itself.
Right. I mean, every tradition speaks of this place being created.
Yes.
And sometimes we tend to overthink it, like in terms of it might be, we want it to be this grand thing, but just creating could be anything. It could be a pocket universe. It could be a bunch of code. Like I created the beginnings of a chatbot, that is trained on Alice Bailey text.
Right.
But in the terms of that lives somewhere in the ether, that code, it's running somewhere in the ether in the same way that our code is running in us.
But what already pre-existed that
Mm-hmm.
was the wisdom of the Creator.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, we're finding ways of giving voice to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's so we're living in times of great destruction. There's a lot of fear generated.
Mm-hmm.
Partly the fear is the fear of death, but the other thing is the fear of what we're perceiving as unkind and heartless acts. There is a lot of weird violence going on in the world at the moment.
Yeah, it's almost like we collectively drew the Tower card for
Yeah.
this current era we're in.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of like but it's destruction as liberation. But you got to go through the destruction part. You have to go through the dark night of the soul. Right?
It's interesting, the Tower, because in the Agni Yoga teachings, the stronghold of the enlightened ones is called the Tower.
Mm.
They live in the Tower.
Mm-hmm.
And it's said that is actually exists in, if you like, on a higher frequency, a subtle realm in the mountains of Tibet. And that's where they live. They live in these towers. It's like a tower block, but not the kind of tower blocks you see in cities.
Mm-hmm.
But inside of there is focused all their creative energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading a paragraph from Agni Yoga this morning saying, you have no idea of the electricity that's created as we are in tense work. Our energies are tensed, and it's like sparks fly.
Yeah.
And the place is electrified. And it says that we have apparatuses that can actually enhance the electricity in the air to help us with our creative process.
Mm.
So it goes back to energy follows thought. And what we are being asked to carry out is the deep desire of the Creator that lives inside every one of us. You mentioned the Bhagavad Gita earlier. Let's use our favorite quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Having pervaded the universe with a fragment of myself, yet I remain. So I'm inside everything.
Mm-hmm.
Every creature. A creature is a product of creation. And yet I remain.
Mm-hmm.
I am. I am that, and I am. And therefore, once we understand we are the I am in its outworking process, life becomes an adventure. And the soul has a way of protecting us from misadventure, unless we've blown the regulator or the buffering system.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're just wild and out of control. And we do harm to ourselves and others.
Mm-hmm.
But we talked about a necessary breakdown. That's how we started this podcast. Unless we have a necessary breakdown now, the spirit of the new will be imprisoned in these old forms that are fighting for their lives, not realizing that their true life lives inside them at a much deeper level. So the forms, the intelligence of the forms themselves are suddenly, if you like, realize that, oh my God, something's going to happen to me. I better hold on. And as you quite rightly said just now, the secret is to surrender, to let go, to give up, to be part of something greater again, to recycle yourself. Appearance, disappearance, reappearance. I mean, if we didn't have reincarnation, the place would be clogged up with these dead forms. The whole of Earth would be one big graveyard we'd be picking our way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's sort of, for me, this is kind of where it all comes back to, in this concept that, creativity emerges from tension, rather than just peace, or striving increases when tension becomes unbearable. Okay, so what does that really mean, and what does that really look like? and what's the point of that? And it seems like the idea of novelty, like, in order to learn, we need some novel new thing. And this is something that I think is mirrored in many people who have been on the path, is that the first half part of your life, the first act of your life is spent trying to find some novel new way to navigate. And then you realize you have to release that and almost become nothing to then become the next thing.
Well, there's a part of your life where you're trying to create a life, an external life, a life of form that you're comfortable with and resonate with.
Mm.
And then the big test is, okay, are you willing to let go of that?
Yeah.
A number of years ago, I wrote an essay called The Fall and Rise of Society.
Mm.
Not the rise and fall. I thought the fall and rise of society. And I just want to read the first few sentences because I think it fits in. I just found it now, on our website. Life is eternal, while its myriad forms of expression are temporal. The perpetual and cyclical motion of the one life causes civilizations to rise and fall and ebb and flow over the span of countless eons. The creative impulse behind any culture or civilization or wave is its mythos, the seed impulse containing the promise for that particular epoch in the continuous pageant of human evolution. The splendid expression of achievement of the seed promise, when revealed through the arts, science, philosophy, governance, marks the golden age of any civilization. And then I wrap it up by saying, before each new cultural wave breaks on the shore of human consciousness, there is great confusion and chaos as time-honored social and philosophical models that no longer serve begin to crumble and lose their integrity. The new seed impulse, like a giant tuning fork, sounds its note, inviting a resonant response. That which cannot respond and serve the call of the new dispensation is welcomed by death in its necessary role as the great recycler of forms. So this is the necessary breakdown. So I pulled that up just because it encapsulates my thinking around this.
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything else? So we don't want to just ramble on.
Well, I was thinking about this, and to me, it became maybe an opportunity to say, because we're recording this and sharing it with the hope that people listen to it, and we're always so and that overjoyed when people reach out to us and say, hey, this really was helpful. So instead of it, I maybe invite people listening to this of thinking about what part of your life is cracking open, and rather than being scared of that, I invite you to sort of hold steady and let these things fall apart. Let that light come in through the crack, and use this as a time for growth. We're all sort of sitting on shaky ground out here in California, but life, we go on with life, and I think that's important to realize, is that that is where the light gets in, and so it's an invitation to take almost inaction. Just let the light come in. Although
the decision to surrender is the highest act of will.
Absolutely.
It really is. It's a consecration, a reconsecration of life with itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what surrender is. It's saying yes, and that yes reverberates all the way through and doesn't let any one aspect of itself get in the way of its continuous revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Without death, we couldn't have revelation. Without the crucifixion, you wouldn't have resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
As an embodied reality. It would be a nice story somewhere.
Yeah.
But we're acting this out on the actual stage.
Mm-hmm.
So here we go.
We look at that crisis as compost, Yeah. All right.
So I think, I wonder how ready we are to really let go, because I just want to say one final thing, Joey, is that often what we hold on to is because we believe that by letting go, we will lose our principles.
Mm.
If our principles and our ethics are really the bedrock of who we are. They're solid. They're uncompromised. When we let go of the form, the truth will always remain. That's what I've learned so far in life. When I let go of that which is not true about myself and others, whether that's a belief or an emotional attachment or even something physical, when I let go of that, that which is true remains. And therefore I recognize it. Oh, that's still here. That's the truth. I don't have to hold on to it because it remains, having pervaded the universe with a fragment of myself, yet I remain.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Michael. And let's all strive to have the sort of bravery of the butterfly that has to break down in the goo inside the chrysalis. Imagine how your whole body turns into a goo. Let's all have the bravery of the butterfly. Yeah.
I'm thinking Mr. Magoo. Mr. Magoo, when he turns into a butterfly, has no longer short-sighted.
Yeah, well, hey, he walks into traffic. He's a brave fella. All right. That was beautiful. Thank you for the episode, Michael.
Thank you, Joe. I love it.
We'll see you next week.